Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Meredith Goldberg-Morse, and I work on the social impact team for MTV, as well as the entertainment and youth brands at VidCon CBS, which includes networks like Comedy Central, VH1, and Country Music Television, among a few others. And today we're going to be talking about how to find effective ways to inspire people to register and vote in the upcoming election. And before we dive in, I just want to make everyone aware that there will be an opportunity for brainstorming and some participation later on in the session. So definitely feel free to get those creative ideas flowing as I'm sharing the first part of this presentation, because there will be an opportunity to share all of your great ideas later. So to kick us off, just moving on to the next slide. I wanted to first share what MTV's mission is for this upcoming election with our Plus One the Vote campaign. And that is to drive first-time voters to tune in and turn out for the 2020 election. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about why we're so focused on first-time voters and why that's such an important opportunity for us. But taking a step back, when we first started thinking about this campaign, we were trying to understand the most effective way to really inspire and mobilize our audiences. And what we know from talking to nonprofits and just our own past campaign efforts is that traditional PSAs are not as effective as they used to be. You know, just having celebrities speaking directly to camera, telling people to vote can be helpful, but is not necessarily the best way to really reach people. So we were trying to think about how we could maybe put our own spin on this campaign this year and try to get a little more creative in how we were reaching our audiences, because we knew there was going to be a lot of noise on social media and we were trying to cut through the clutter. And what we realized is that we have an opportunity to really leverage our biggest asset, our content that goes out on our linear platforms and on our digital platforms, to try to incorporate voting messages and information about voting and registering in a way that feels more organic and entertaining than your traditional PSA or your traditional campaign content. And before we dive into what that looks like, it's helpful to just take a step back and understand kind of the landscape of voting and why we felt like this was such an effective strategy. So you'll see some information on the next slide that kind of outlines that. So before diving into this process, we wanted to talk to the best civic engagement experts out there and the nonprofit organizations who are really on the ground doing this work to understand what it could look like. And we came away from those conversations and those partnerships with a couple of key insights that we've been applying to our campaign content ever since, which you'll see on the next slide after this one. So first of all, I mentioned earlier that we're focused on first-time voters specifically. And part of the reasoning for that is we know that this upcoming election could be the first presidential election in which Gen Z and millennial voters could surpass baby boomers as the largest voting bloc. But that's a big if, because that actually requires Gen Z and millennials to not only register, but also turn out on election day. But the good news is we know that young people are ready to participate. They're energized and they're ready to go. So there is a lot of sensitivity around the idea that the political system is broken. And we see those perceptions on both sides of the aisle. But the good news is that instead of just throwing up our hands and saying, well, the system's broken, we just need to walk away, young people are ready to roll up our sleeves and actually try to get involved to fix it. And nearly 80% of young people believe that our generation can really make a difference and that voting is actually one of the best ways to do that. We also know that storytelling and content, particularly mainstream entertainment content, has a huge role to play in actually converting young people into voters. So first of all, we know that young people are far more likely to vote when they turn 18 if they're actually taught about elections and voting. But I think we probably all know that like Gov class and civics lessons in school are not necessarily the most effective way to get that message across. So there's a way to educate people about voting through content that's outside of kind of traditional educational settings or platforms, and it's going to actually resonate with people in a way that's much more engaging and sticky. We also know that 60% of young people have never even been asked to register, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. And there are ways to spread information and awareness about registration in content to make sure that 100% of the people who are seeing MTV's content or who are seeing the content that you're putting out on your platforms have at least been asked to register and has that initial touch point. And this is a critical point that's going to come up a little bit later as well. But we also know that young people, so millennials and Gen Z specifically, are less likely than older generations to feel like voting is actually part of who they are or part of their identity. And we know that content and storytelling has a huge role to play in helping shape people's identities. And that if we're able to help young people feel like voting is part of who they are at an early age, that can then become a habit that they carry with them through their whole life. And it would be pretty impossible to talk about voting in this upcoming election without talking about the fact that this election is going to look different than any election that's come before because of the pandemic. So one key insight that we've seen is that compared to 2016 and previous elections, the number of new voters who have registered by this point in time has significantly decreased. And that's mainly because a lot of the traditional tactics that groups use to actually get people registered involve in-person contact, like canvassing in a high traffic area or going door to door in the neighborhood to get people to register. It's a very kind of old school approach that most groups take to get folks registered. And those things just haven't been happening for the past 5 months while we've been dealing with this pandemic. We also know that a large percentage of voters are concerned about how the pandemic might affect their ability to vote. I think a lot of people are rightfully feeling a little bit cautious about the idea of going to stand in line with a bunch of strangers, potentially for hours on end, on election day and trying to think about how there are potentially different ways of doing things, which means that this year, more than ever before, alternative forms of voting, like voting early or voting by mail or absentee voting, are more important than ever. And they're going to play a crucial role in how many people are actually going to be able to turn out and make their voice heard in the upcoming election. So we'll be talking a little bit later about how we can start to integrate some of those alternative forms of voting into content so that people become more informed and just more comfortable with the idea of voting in a different way that they have before. And before we start to get into some of the messaging tactics that we've used at MTV, I wanted to give you a little peek at what it actually looks like to incorporate voting and civic engagement messages into mainstream content. So first, we're going to take a look at a clip from a series called Life After Quince on MTV's sister network, Awesomeness TV. So we can go ahead and roll this clip.
Estas son las margaritas que
We're so bad. We're the worst.
We're really bad at singing. So
thank you. Birthday.
you guys are so sweet. Thank you.
Alyssa, I'm so happy you came.
Yeah, no problem. I'd do anything to be here with you.
Oh, I needed this stress reliever. I've been here a couple times before, and it's like so relaxing.
Really?
They like massage your face so nicely.
I'm excited. I'm ready to be relaxed.
Me too. I need it.
So, how does it feel being 18?
18,
The
Candy.
big one. You're officially an adult?
You're legal. Yes.
Oh my God.
Feels pretty cool, you know. The one thing that I want to do now that I'm 18 is I want to register to vote.
Yeah.
So cool, yeah.
When you're 18, you could do that, huh?
Yeah, we're 18, we could do it. You could pre-register to vote.
Wait, you can pre-register?
Yeah, you can pre-register.
Oh wow, I never knew that.
And I think it's like perfect timing, especially with like all the like chaos that's happening right now with like the school.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I love about this particular clip is that they kind of sneak in the information about voting and that conversation into a larger storyline about the character's birthday and this fun spa day that they're all doing. So they're at the spa, they're having fun, they're celebrating the birthday, and then they're just sneaking in a little bit of information about voting and why the character is so excited to vote. And they also touch on a really important theme, and it's something that we actually get asked about a lot at MTV because so many of our fans are under 18. What can you actually do if you want to get involved, but you're not yet eligible to vote because you're too young? And in a lot of cases, there are many states that enable things like pre-registering, which means that you can set it up so that when you are maybe 16 or 17, you can pre-register, and therefore you have a much smaller hurdle to jump through when you're 18 and it's time to actually vote. So there are things that you can actually do to prepare at a younger age, and I love that they just touch on that in the course of a normal conversation. This next clip is a little different. This one is from The Daily Show, and so we're going to roll this clip, and then I'll talk a little bit about why it's so effective.
The question is, why don't young people want to go to the polls? Well, to help us get our heads around this, we're proud to announce our newest Daily Show edition, senior youth correspondent Jabuki Young White, everybody! Welcome. So great to have you here. Jabuki, welcome to the show. All right, let's get into it, man. As young people, we know that we should be voting, but we don't seem to be enthusiastic enough. So what can we do to increase the turnouts?
Okay, well, first of all, Trevor, we're gonna need to stop saying we, because you're old.
Okay, hold up. No, don't let the tie fool you. I'm also the youth. I was born in 1984.
Oh, 1984. Okay, vintage millennial. Oh, nice. See, Trevor, I'm young. You know, you're old young, kind of like Nick Cannon. You know? Like, how old is he? 30, 50? Like, I can't really... Like, I have young in my name, literally, right there. And your name is Noah, like that creepy old guy who made those animals on a boat, you know?
Well, it wasn't a boat, it was an ark. But whatever, let's move on. Like, Jabuki, I'm trying to get to the bottom of this. Why aren't more young people excited about voting?
Why aren't more young people excited about voting? What you should be asking is why the youth vote is being suppressed.
Oh, of course. Voter suppression is a big issue in America. I mean, we saw the Supreme Court ruling about North Dakota disenfranchising.
No. You're talking about old people shit again, Trevor. No. I'm talking about how voting is designed for old people. Like, why do we still use paper to vote? Paper is over. I don't even wipe my ass with paper. You know, I use a bidet app. And like, why do I have to go out to vote? Can't you just Postmates the election to me, you know? Like, oh, Tony will be here in 20 minutes with my ballot and my seaweed salad? Dope, okay. Plus, now they want to require an ID. Where am I about to get an ID?
Wait. You don't have a driver's license?
Oh my God, Trevor, you are as funny as my mom said. Like, look, I don't need a driver's license. My Uber driver needs a driver's license. In fact, if you want my ID, my Uber is the best ID there is. It's got my face, it's got my rating, 4.8. And all my driver's license will tell you is where I once lived. My Uber tells you where I'm trying to be, you know? Like right now, I could take any of your phones and be like, oh, they went there, and there, and they took a pool, they're gonna vote for Bernie, you know?
Okay, but that doesn't explain the lack of enthusiasm, right? 57% of older people are very excited to go vote.
Yeah, of course they are, because 57% of their life is just time off. When you're old, you have the luxury of free time, you know? Who else can play chess in a park at 4 p.m.? And why is voting on a Tuesday? That's the hardest day to take off, which reminds me, can I take off next Tuesday?
No, what? Dude, no, you just started.
See, that's what I'm talking about. That's that shit, Trevor.
Jabuki, there's no election next Tuesday. What are you talking about?
Look, that's not the point. You want young people to vote? Make Election Day a national holiday. You know? Yes. Like President's Day or Toyotathon. You know?
Okay. So let me get this right. If America adopts digital voting,
yes,
and if they allow people to do it from home,
yes,
and they make Election Day a national holiday, yes, then young people will definitely vote?
Oh, no. Why would I spend my day off voting? I'm trying to see what this park chest is all about.
Jabuki Young White, everybody.
So in addition to being incredibly funny, that clip also does a great job of just highlighting some of the really confusing aspects of voting and making it really clear that as millennials and Gen Z become a larger and larger part of the electorate, the way we vote is going to need to change. And I think that this upcoming election is going to be such a great example of that, because we're going to see more and more people taking advantage of some of those alternative forms of voting that I mentioned earlier, and they'll probably start to become the norm as time goes on. So this was a way of kind of raising awareness about how some of those things need to change while making it clear that it's still important for young people to make their voices heard. And finally, we have a very different type of content from the season finale of the latest season of RuPaul's Drag Race. So we're going to show this clip and then talk about why it's so effective.
It's 2020, time to vote Henny. Let's make some history. Oh yeah! Mail-in or absentee, support your nominee. Do it for RBG and me. Register! Put your ballot in the box. Democracy. Let our voting body talk. Register! Get your booty to that booth. Loud and proud. Let your vote show your truth. Vote and vote. Rock the vote and vote. And what?
I vote because it is my right as a U.S. citizen.
Together, we have the power to change America.
Not only for the queers of now, but the queers of tomorrow. I'm Canadian, so I can't vote. But boy, if I could. And you can. It's easy to register right now. Register! Put that ballot in that box. Democracy. Let your voting body talk. Vote. Yeah. And vote!
Throwing shade is cheap, but voting is free.
The most revolutionary thing you can do is vote. And what?
One of the reasons I love that segment in particular is because it just fits in so well with the style and tone of Drag Race overall. And they're really using the fan favorite queens. And also they filmed that entire thing in the middle of a pandemic. So it was all self-filmed and really shows how you can make fun, engaging, sticky content, even with the very limited resources, without a lot of, fancy equipment or a full production team. Like, that was really just the queens doing their thing and making some really amazing content. So now that we've gotten a look at what it can actually look like to incorporate civic engagement messages into lots of different types of content for lots of different audiences and different platforms, I'm going to talk through some of the messages that we know are effective. And as I'm doing that, I want you to just start thinking about how you might apply these messages to the platforms that you have available to you, whether it's your own social media platforms or whether you create content for another platform, or it's just messaging tactics that you could incorporate into conversations with your friends and family. We all have a role to play in making sure that folks turn out in this upcoming election. And these are some ways that we know actually work to create some productive conversations and really move the needle. So let's dive in. This is all based on research that the Ad Council Democracy Works did quite recently around what messages motivate voters. And we're going to go into each one of these messages in a little bit more depth and share some examples of what that could look like and some entry points for storytelling around them. So first on the list, this is the messaging strategy that we found is actually most effective across the board for all age groups, for all demographics. So on the next slide, you'll see that issues really resonate with people, and illustrating the connection between voting and the issues that you care about or the issues that other people care about is truly the most effective way that you can inspire people to make their voice heard. And there are a couple of ways that we recommend doing that, or ways that you can start to think about incorporating that message into content that you're creating. The first is really being thoughtful about how different issues intersect with one another, because there might be an issue that you're really passionate about that's personal to you, or that you know a friend or your fans are really passionate about, but you're not necessarily sure how it relates to some of the conversations that are happening at a national level when it comes to the election. But thinking through how some of these different issues are connected is a really helpful way to start to connect the dots and draw those connections. So for example, reproductive rights and the healthcare conversation more generally, or thinking about how affordable housing can be related to racial justice, and how some of the issues that might affect you personally or that you're particularly passionate about might connect into some of these larger conversations. Also, we know that across the board, one of the most effective things you can talk about is the personal impact or your personal experiences. So talking about how you've been affected by an issue and why you are inspired to vote to make a change on that issue is a really great way to kind of draw a connection and make it feel really personal and engaging. And we also know, because local elections are such a great way to create really tangible and more immediate change, sometimes more so than voting in a national election, that talking about why you're passionate about issues that are coming up in a local election can be really effective as well. So moving on to the next messaging tactic, we also know that empowerment is a message that particularly resonates with Gen Z and millennials. And it's that idea that you actually have a role to play in creating the future you want to see, and that voting is a way to do that. And this idea that your voice matters and therefore your vote matters can be very inspiring to people. Also providing tangible examples of what it actually looks like to vote and then create some sort of change or have an impact, and really identifying how maybe someone who was elected in the 2018 midterm elections is actually making a big change for their community today, and showing how voting can actually have a clear impact. And then finally, there are lots of ways to get involved and make a difference and really show the impact of that involvement beyond just voting. You could canvass for a candidate that you're really passionate about. You could phone bank, you could text bank, you could run for office yourself. I mean, who's to say that you can't? So there are lots of ways to get involved in the political system and make your voice heard going beyond voting. And we hope that voting is just the first step. So as an example of what that could look like, maybe get involved in a civic action like canvassing or phone banking or a local political race that you're passionate about, and really show how that involvement makes a difference and kind of demystify that process and what it can look like. And as I mentioned earlier, there is kind of a gap when it comes to younger people feeling like voting is part of their identity. For a lot of older generations, it's kind of something that is ingrained as part of who they are, but that's not always the case for millennials and Gen Z. So one of the most effective ways to fill that gap when you're speaking to a younger audience or when you're dealing with your peers is to celebrate this idea of being a voter, the same way that people celebrate other aspects of their identity, because it really is something to be proud of. And one of the simplest ways to do that is just to think about the language that you're using. So instead of saying, oh, I voted or I'm going to vote, why not say I am a voter or I am becoming a voter in this upcoming election? Also, voting is a choice. We make a lot of choices in our day-to-day lives, and some of those choices are things that we want to elevate because we're really proud of them. So why not just make voting one of those choices that you're proud of, you want to celebrate, and that you want to speak out about? And finally, we also know that there's a diversity of first-time voters. I think often when you're thinking about what a first-time voter looks like, you might think, oh, it's like a freshman in college who just turned 18 and they're going to go vote for the first time. But the truth is, anyone who hasn't voted before can become a first-time voter. So there's no reason that even if you didn't become a first-time voter when you were 18 and first became eligible, that you cannot become one now. And we want to make sure that when we're talking about voting, we're creating content about voting, we're really showing the diversity of first-time voters. So in your own content and on your own platforms, consider highlighting when you became a voter for the first time, what that experience was like, why you're so proud of it, why you want to celebrate it, or if you're planning to become a voter in 2020, talk about why and why you're so excited to do so. And this is actually one that comes from MTV's midterm election campaign in 2018, which was also called Plus One the Vote. And what we saw after that campaign is that this particular message is one that's really sticky and really engaging and actually incredibly effective in inspiring people and also just kind of spreading voting beyond the individual that we're reaching with content. And that is to show voting as a social activity. I think voting can have a bit of a reputation maybe for being boring or not being exciting. No one's like, oh my God, I'm so stoked to go to the polls next week. It's going to be so fun. Most people, it's just like a chore or something that they know they have to do because it's important to them, but not necessarily something that they perceive as like fun or exciting. So in content, how can we think about ways to make voting seem more fun, more exciting, more social, and more like something that's actually a desirable activity to participate in versus something you just need to check off of your to-do list? Because the more people think that it's going to be fun, the more likely they are to actually do it. And we found that FOMO is actually a great strategy here. Usually FOMO is perceived in a negative light, but in this case, we want to make people feel like if they're not voting, they're missing out or they're not doing something that everyone else is doing. And similarly with peer pressure, often we would say, don't pressure your peers. Maybe it's like usually associated with activities that you don't want people to be doing. But in this case, peer pressure is actually a great thing that we want to encourage. We want every young person to be encouraging all of their peers to turn out and vote and really applying that pressure in the right way. So as just a really simple example of this, talk about who you're voting with this year. Who's your plus one to the polls? Make sure that you're getting your friends and family involved. And if they're not super stoked to vote, ask them to be your plus one and find ways to make it a more kind of fun and social activity. Throw a party afterward if we're allowed to be in spaces with other people in November, or make it some other sort of milestone so that you're really celebrating this act of voting. And finally, I mentioned earlier that voting is going to probably be a bit of a challenge this year. And that's not to say that it wasn't before. There are a lot of people for many reasons and many valid reasons who find that the system of registering and voting is very overwhelming or confusing. And it's certainly not geared toward young people because a lot of the methods that we use to vote are very traditional and very old school. And it's a lot of paperwork and it's a lot of filling out forms. And sometimes you have to find a stamp and that's just hard. But one of the ways that we can kind of combat that and make people feel like it's more manageable is to actually show the steps involved in registering voting and help viewers prepare, help them envision what that process is going to be like and what it's going to look like so that they're more likely to actually participate in it. And one of the most important things to emphasize here is that there are very real barriers to voting, and we don't want to minimize that. You know, in some cases, there's only one polling location for a whole region, and you have to stand in line, or it might be hard to get there. And those are very real structural barriers that we don't want to be dismissive of. But sometimes focusing too much on the problems around voting or why it's hard can actually be really disempowering or make people less likely to feel like they want to vote because they're like, oh, if it's going to be too hard, why would I do it? It's like a very discouraging message. So instead of focusing on all of the problems, focus on solutions, like the fact that all of these new poll workers are signing up to make sure that people can get in and out of their polling location faster, or folks who are working to get polling locations on college campuses or in jails so that people can vote where they are and not need to travel so many miles just to hand in their ballot, or opening up access to vote by mail in certain regions. There are a lot of people who are working on solutions, so it's helpful to elevate those so that people don't get too discouraged when they're thinking about the process of voting. As I mentioned, alternative forms of voting are going to play a huge role in this election. So one of the things that we can do to help viewers prepare and help them understand how to vote is actually understand what their options are. So MTV is participating in something called a Vote Early Day. We're in October. We're actually going to be educating all of our viewers alongside many other brands about how and when and why to vote early. Because what that can do is, first of all, take the pressure off of you as an individual from feeling like you can only vote on a certain day. And for folks who do have to vote on election day, it means that fewer people will be at the polling location. There might be less lengthy lines, and it just takes pressure off of the system for everybody. So thinking about how you can talk about or educate around some of those alternative forms of voting in your content is going to be really helpful, particularly this year. And finally, there are just some small language tweaks that can help you talk about voting access in a way that's productive and not discouraging. Because often when people hear phrases like voter suppression or voter fraud, it can be kind of overwhelming or scary or perpetuate this idea that voting is overwhelming or something to be afraid of. Whereas using a phrase like voter access is a much more positive spin on the same idea. So thinking about the language you're using, and again, focusing on solutions when it comes to helping people vote. And one of the insights that we learned from our expert partners is that people who actually have a plan for how and when they're going to vote are significantly more likely to actually do it. So you can help the audiences that you reach or your peers or your fans simply by sharing your own voting plans, who you're voting with, like who's your +1 to the polls, what you're going to wear, which interestingly is one of the questions that voting organizations get asked most frequently. Like some people truly don't vote because they do not know what they're supposed to wear, and then it becomes a really scary and overwhelming process. So share your election day outfit or what you're wearing on vote early day to go hand in your ballot at the nearest mailbox. Share your voting playlist. All of these little details can help people kind of visualize what it's going to look like and help them think about what their own voting plan might be. And taking a step back, across all of these message frames, we know that there are some really great tactics you can use in content just to make sure that you're going to resonate with the widest audience possible and that your content is going to really reflect the people who are viewing it. So depicting things like intergenerational voting and people of all ages, as I mentioned, not all first-time voters are 18-year-old college freshmen. So thinking about how you can depict people of all ages and all different aspects of life participating in the process, showing lower or mid propensity voters, basically meaning people who are historically less likely to vote, like young people and people of color. Really showing those communities getting involved can play a huge role in helping people envision themselves as part of that process. And also lifting up stories of everyday people. So sometimes it feels like when we're looking at content around voting, it's either celebrities talking about it, or it's like these really exceptional activists or people who are very involved in the political space. But the truth is, we need everybody, no matter how political you are, no matter whether you're an activist, no matter whether you're a celebrity, to vote in this upcoming election. So telling your own story just as an individual or lifting up the stories of kind of everyday people can help the people who are interacting with your content really see themselves. And finally, I was talking a little bit earlier about some of the systemic reasons that people might not vote. There are a lot of barriers in place to voting. So instead of blaming certain communities for not voting previously or not typically turning out in high numbers, let's talk about or think about what we can do to actually inspire those communities to vote moving forward or remove some of those structural barriers. And finally, these are some guidelines that we actually sourced with the creative teams at MTV, so the teams that produce our content on air and our digital content, and the recommendations that they have for incorporating voting or really any issue into content. The first is having a clear intention and understanding from the beginning kind of what you're setting out to do or what kind of message you're trying to send your audience. Leaning on traditional storytelling tactics like humor and emotion to make sure that your content is not just informative, but also really compelling and engaging. Authenticity is also key here. Content should not feel like it's forced or like you're putting in a particular message or information where it doesn't really belong or doesn't feel natural. And also not to be too preachy, because again, people are not looking for government or civics lessons in the content that you're creating. So making sure that it still has that amazing, fun, engaging, entertaining tone that you would typically use. And finally, this one was really interesting. When we were talking about it with our content teams, they were like, so if we're creating content around voting, do we need to use red, white, and blue? Should we use the American flag? Does it need to look like it's political content? And the answer is absolutely not. Sometimes when people see stuff like that, they just tune out because they're like, oh, it's another political ad, or oh, it's another piece of voting content leading up to this big presidential election. And it doesn't necessarily engage them the same way. So any voting messages or content that you're creating should really feel authentic to your style and tone. And you can play with the same kind of iconography and visuals that you typically would. You don't need to change your entire style so that it feels very political. In fact, that actually is usually not the best way to do things, because people are watching your content or interacting with your platforms because of you and what you have to offer. So just continue to lean into that. So it looks like we're having a little bit of trouble just going to the next slide in the presentation. So for now, I'm just going to tell you how this is going to work, and then we can dive right in when the slides are working again. So basically, as I was saying, we're going to put a question up on screen. And for 3 minutes, I want you to just think of all the possible ways that you could answer that question. And we definitely want you to have an opportunity to share all of your great ideas. So as you think of things or concepts or ideas, feel free to just throw them into the chat. And also feel free to engage with ideas that other folks are putting in the chat. And then at the end of the 3 brainstorm questions, you're going to have an opportunity to share with the full group. So we're going to pull some of you up on stage to share your ideas. So before we dive in, these are some creative principles that we use at MTV that I just wanted to share with you before we start brainstorming. The first, as I mentioned, relates to quantity. So we're not looking for the perfect idea here. We're actually just looking for as many ideas as you have. And this idea is that if you just generate a lot of concepts, you can go back and kind of refine and build on them at a later time. So it's more about getting the ideas out than having that one perfect idea. And to that same point, you don't want to overthink it. Just whatever pops in your head, put it in the chat, write it on a piece of paper, whatever works for you. But it's going to be a really effective way to just kind of get those ideas out. And don't take it too seriously. Be playful, be fun. The whole point is to come up with really entertaining and engaging ideas. So don't worry too much about having, the perfect concept. So to recap, I'm going to put a question up on the next slide. You're going to have 3 minutes to just pop any idea you can think of into the chat and interact with the ideas that other folks are putting in the chat as well. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, your 3 minutes starts right now. All right, so hope you all had a chance to get some great ideas out. We're going to move on to the next focus question on the next slide, which is how can you use your platforms to help people understand how to register and vote? So this goes back to the point earlier about helping people kind of understand what that's going to look like and have a plan. So we're going to give you another 3 minutes just to get those ideas out. All right, so moving on to our last question. How can you use your platforms to connect the issues you care about to voting? So as I mentioned earlier, people are across the board most motivated to vote because they want to make a change on the issues they care about. So how can you share what you're passionate about in order to inspire others to vote to create change? And again, we're going to give you just a couple minutes to get those ideas out, and then we'll give some time for folks to share their ideas if they want or ask some questions. So your couple minutes to brainstorm on this topic starts now. All right, so now that we've gotten all of those ideas out, we want to make sure that you have a chance to share with the group if you want to. So if you have an idea that you would like to share, you can go ahead and pop it in using the ask button, so that question mark button below. Oops, I just clicked something, not sure if it created an issue. Or use the raise hand button and the folks at VidCon will pull you up on screen. So again, you can submit your ideas or let the VidCon team know that you would like to share by using the ask button with the question mark. Yeah, I'm seeing an idea about attracting young people with rewards because everyone loves gifts. And that is a really great point and something that we've been trying to incorporate into MTV's campaign, although there is a catch, which is that legally you can't incentivize or directly reward someone for registering to vote. So we try to find interesting ways around that. Like if you, for example, sign up to send emails to your friends, encouraging them to register, maybe you'll be entered to win tickets to the VMAs or something like that. So we're not directly incentivizing registration, but we're saying if you spread the word about voting and encourage your friends to do so, you could be entered to win some sort of reward. Or sometimes we'll use like swag or rewards like that to draw attention to our efforts. So what we've done on some of our live shows is actually register voters on the ground. So if you're an audience member at Wild and Out, or you're in the audience at the VMAs, which is hypothetical because we're not going to have a live audience at the VMAs this year, there might be a big booth where you can go and you can get your MTV swag and you can take pictures with the photo backdrop and all of that, but you can also register to vote. So we kind of use rewards and things like that to draw people in, and then it's a great time to hit them with some information or encourage them to vote. Any other ideas that folks would like to share with the full group? Again, you can use that ask button. Oh, I see we're spotlighting someone.
Hi, Meredith. Love the presentation. I specifically was thinking about using the register to vote sticker on like Instagram stories, especially for people who have really large followings. It's such a like simple and quick way to educate and inspire your followers. So that was my idea.
Yeah, I love that. There are so many great ways to use platforms like Instagram and things like that to just spread the word in very simple ways by using like fun stickers, fun graphics, really quick videos. And that is a really great and effective way to get the message out there. I love that idea. And I know we are approaching the end of our time together, so also wanted to open it up for questions that anyone may have about MTV's Plus One the Vote campaign or the work that the Social Impact team does to incorporate voting messages into our content, or just about voting in general. And again, you can use the ask button to do that. Well, it looks like that is all the time we have. So thank you everyone so much for joining this session. Loved all of the ideas. And we can keep the conversation going if you want on the Discord app. So you can go ahead and find, I believe it's called the Voter Engagement channel on that app. And I'll be hopping on there in a few minutes if anyone has any remaining questions or just wants to share some additional ideas. Thanks everyone. Bye.